Hi, good morning. As we prepare for midterms, let us revisit some of the key ideas I've encountered in the study of Philippine popular culture. As you might recall, one major area to focus on is the source of the knowledge that we study in pop culture. Audience studies, for instance, plays a crucial role in understanding how people consume and make meaning from cultural texts. In short, we do not just understand, we do not just study the music, the songs themselves, but also the audience consuming the texts. Unlike folk beliefs or cultural statistics, you might say, um, folk beliefs do not tell us about uh, directly about contemporary pop culture, right? Agricultural statistics are not directly connected to Philippine pop culture. Therefore, they're not sources of knowledge when it comes to Philippine pop culture. Audience studies instead can be one. They provide direct insight into the preferences and behaviors of individuals as they engage with pop culture. Right. Another critical method used in the field of pop culture is textual analysis of cultural products. One of them um, are films. Okay? We also have TV shows. It's also equally important to recognize the limitations and inappropriate methods that do not align with ethical or rigorous research, such as eavesdropping and wiretapping. Of course, these are not established or proper means by which we collect data for popular culture research. These are invasive and do not contribute validly to popular studies. Instead, proper methodologies like surveys, ethnography, direct interaction with communities offer more ethical and insightful data collection approaches. The historical and cultural contexts surrounding Philippine pop culture significantly shape the values that are reflected in its various forms. Cultural products often embody of a complex mix of traditional and modern Filipino values shaped by the country's colonial past and its ongoing negotiation with global influences. In short, we must study the socio-political, the economic even, um, dimensions of Philippine society in order to contextualize our study of Philippine culture. This means that understanding these cultural texts requires an appreciation of how historical events and social shifts influence the themes, narratives, and representations that we see in popular media. When it comes to studying audience preferences and consumption patterns, quantitative surveys provide a more systematic way to gather data. Such surveys can offer a broad overview of how different demographics engage with popular culture, allowing for more generalizable insights. But take note, combining this with more qualitative approaches like ethnography enriches our understanding, giving a more nuanced view of the cultural significance of phenomena like viral memes, okay, for example, which have become central to Filipino identity in the digital age. Speaking of digital platforms, the rise of um, platforms like YouTube, TikTok, this rise poses a challenge to traditional approaches in cultural studies. These platforms, take note, um, these platforms do what? They decentralize content creation. That's their essential contribution. Meaning that scholars must now adopt multi-method approaches, okay, to grasp how diverse groups engage with pop. Unlike earlier media forms where content was produced by a few and consumed by many, digital platforms today blur the lines between creators and audiences, requiring new ways of understanding cultural phenomena. Ethical considerations will also come to the forefront when we examine how indigenous symbols are commodified in Philippine fashion. What do you mean by commodified, kanang ibang ratahan, that's commodification. While these symbols may become more visible in popular culture, which means it's a pro in a sense, there's also the risk of reinforcing historical injustices and marginalizing the very communities that the symbols that are being appropriated represent. This is where post-colonial methodologies, okay, take note, post-colonial methodologies offer deep insights into the legacy of colonialism, helping us critique how cultural symbols are repurposed in ways that either resist or perpetuate colonial legacies. So take note of the crucial concept which is called cultural appropriation, which is the erroneous um, representation of a certain cultural phenomenon in a way that is offensive to the group that is being represented. That's cultural appropriation. Still within the topic of the fundamentals of pop culture research. To further enrich our understanding, take note, combining quantity surveys, as said earlier, with ethnographic research allows for a more comprehensive analysis of the phenomena. So if you're asked, for example, if you look at statistical data on mean consumption alongside rich contextual observations from online communities, uh, take note that that approach, that act of combining the two sources of data, two streams of data, that allows us to capture the full scope of how these digital artifacts shape Filipino cultural identity. Right. Some key themes that emerge in our study of pop culture. For example, when you analyze teleseries using a postmodern lens, okay, what happens? When you use the postmodern lens, you challenge the traditional hierarchy between quote high and quote low culture. By blurring the boundaries between the elite and mass culture, we can deconstruct the idea that popular forms are inherently inferior. This aligns with critical theory, which is crucial in revealing the power structures embedded in media representation, allowing us to critique not just the content, but also the underlying societal forces that shape it. We talked about the different ways to define Philippine pop culture, or particularly pop culture, right? And the problems and limitations in each definition. One way to define pop culture is as quantitatively superior. What does that mean? Just because something is consumed by a huge number of people, according to this way of defining pop culture, that cultural text is systematically called pop culture. Okay, when when is something when does something qualify as pop culture? According to this view, it qualifies as pop culture when it is quantitatively superior. What does quantitatively mean in terms of numbers? Superior meaning more. So if there's a cultural text that is consumed by the majority, then it's pop culture. Now, what are the limitations of this way of defining pop culture? Just because something is popular does not mean that it has deep cultural meaning, right? This perspective oversimplifies the complexity of cultural texts and their significance in various social contexts. Now, on the flip side, viewing pop culture as quote qualitatively inferior, which is another way of defining pop culture, right? That's what we called in our very first on-site meeting. Viewing pop culture as quote qualitatively inferior, meaning pop culture it is in this view is anything that is inferior to high culture. Okay. So in this view, one limitation is that it reduces pop culture to a lesser form of expression, particularly when it comes to genres like pop music, just often seen as less artistically valuable compared to classical music. In short, it is stereotypical. It is biased in a way because it automatically disqualifies pop culture from being deep, from being profound, when sometimes that is not the case. Another way of defining pop culture that we have discussed is seeing pop culture as a battlefield for hegemony, especially in the context of modern social media. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram have become spaces where different groups compete for cultural and political influence, challenging the dominance of traditional power structures. Take note, what does this mean? This notion of pop culture as a contested space. That's the heart of this view of pop culture. That pop culture is a contested space. In short, it is a place where um, certain certain groups of people battle for influence. where various groups negotiate power and representation. Okay. This view, pop culture, is central to our understanding of the role of pop culture in society today. In short, we can look at, for example, when there's a cultural text, we can look at, for example, using a Foucauldian discourse analysis lens, we can look at um, which group benefits from this cultural um, text, which group is being marginalized in this cultural text. This approach aligns with the view of pop culture as a battlefield for hegemony. These ideas, drawn from the intersections of cultural theory, postcolonial thought, and digital media studies, will be the foundation for midterm exams, at least in the first part. Um, in the second part, sa sunod, sumpay pa ni. Still about the different ways of conceptualizing pop culture. So how do the theorists who view pop culture as a criteria to be deconstructed by modernism conceptualize pop culture? Take note, we need to consider how postmodernism has challenged traditional understandings of cultural products. So, what difference does postmodernism make to our study of pop culture? So, recall that postmodernism emphasizes the complexity and contradictions inherent in pop culture. By viewing cultural products as quote, a chimera to be deconstructed, postmodernism reveals the multiple walang chimera, right? Because um, there are many layers to it. The multiple, often hidden layers of meaning within these products. This contrasts with earlier, more straightforward interpretations that might have viewed pop culture as simplistic or lacking in depth. The postmodern approach invites us to appreciate the nuanced, sometimes contradictory cultural messages embedded within media, art, and everyday practices. We look at the work of Nuncio, right? And his argument that on the popular days that his argument regarding the popularization of pop culture during colonialism. He says that the popularization of culture during colonialism provides a lens through which we can understand contemporary Philippine pop culture. Today, Filipino pop culture reflects a blend of local and foreign influences, and this hybridity is very much a product of the historical processes of colonialism. The fusion of local values with global commercialism local, shows the lasting influence of colonial legacies shaping how Filipinos create and consume culture. This legacy is not merely historical but continues to inform how Filipino pop culture interacts with globalized trends today. Postmodernism's emphasis on cultural complexity also deepens our understanding of humor in internet memes, particularly when used as social commentary. Memes, take note, one item we'll talk about this one. Themes, especially those addressing issues like climate change, often mask deeper social anxieties and contradictions beneath their humorous surface. In short, it appears apparently just like a joke, right? But it actually hides social anxieties and contradictions, right? That are far more serious than uh, what apparently appears at the first glance. Far from being mere entertainment, memes can serve as powerful tools for social critique, providing a way to express discontent or anxiety about pressing issues in a manner that resonates with a wide audience. In short, it's a way of communicating the anxiety about a social ill, right, in a way that is easily consumable, that is easily that resonates with a wide audience through the humor. This dual nature of humor on the one hand and critique on the other is a key feature of how postmodernism interprets cultural products. Okay, this chimera. Okay, there's two layers here: the deep social anxiety and the surface level humor. Another major theme we've encountered in the study of pop culture is the influence of commercial interests on pop culture. The rise of digital platforms like TikTok has blurred the lines between grassroots cultural expressions and corporate interests. For example, while everyday users create viral TikTok dances, brands quickly adopt these trends for advertising purposes. This dynamic between the grassroots and the corporate, this dynamic illustrates how commercial interests can shape and influence what becomes popular, highlighting the tension between authentic cultural expressions and the commodification in the corporate side in the digital age. The coexistence between The coexistence of traditional Filipino values with globalized cultural products is also best understood through the chimera interpretation of culture, which is polar, right? Filipino pop culture is not a monolithic entity. Rather, it reflects a global nature. What we mean by global is the simultaneous intersection of the local and the global, where local traditions and global influences mix, sometimes in contradictory ways. This complexity is a hallmark of Filipino culture where old and new, foreign and local coexist, influencing everything from fashion to entertainment. We also talked about more fundamental sociological concepts um, in the study of culture as part of the syllabus. One is the concept of walkways, another is the concept of mores. We observe that everyday behaviors like wearing casual clothing to a family picnic are examples of walkways, which are simply the customary ways of behaving that are informal and habitual. Whereas mores, on the other hand, are more serious ethical standards, such as those related to societal norms around morality and decency. Mores are not merely optional. Okay? They're not like walkways that are merely optional social habits, but are foundational to the ethical structure of society. So in short, which carries more moral weight is mores, right? Walkways are a bit lighter. We also discussed culture in its non-material aspects like beliefs and values. For instance, a belief in democracy is a non-material element of culture because you cannot touch this this belief, right? The belief itself is still part of culture. It's an element of culture, but it's non-material. Unlike physical objects or technological advancements, okay, like for example, like a piece of as in tipo or a piece of something that is tangible, right? Beliefs are still elements of culture, but they are non-material. They shape how societies function and evolve, though they cannot be seen or touched directly. And it's precisely these beliefs that influence pop culture, right? The element of culture that is non-material is typically what influences first our interpretation of pop culture texts. Now, there's another concept, the concept of culture shock. Okay? The concept of culture shock arises when individuals encounter unfamiliar cultural practices, leading to a sense of disorientation. Take note, culture shock is distinct from ethnocentrism. Lahi na sila. In ethnocentrism, um, that is the view, or that is the phenomenon when a person views his own culture as superior than all other cultures. The flip side of this is xenocentrism, where foreign cultures are now seen as better than one's own culture. We already tackled this, just reviewing these key concepts. But both ethnocentrism and xenocentrism are challenged by another key concept, which is cultural relativism, the middle, the golden mean in the between the two extremes of ethnocentrism and xenocentrism. Cultural relativism advocates for understanding cultural practices within their own context without judgment. Cultural relativism encourages us to adopt a more objective view of different cultural norms and traditions, wherein you do not see another culture as superior to yours, like in xenocentrism. You do not see your own culture as superior to others, like in ethnocentrism. Instead, you just understand the inner logic, okay, of the different cultures that you engage with. The notion of culture lag, particularly in the context of technological advancements, points to the gap that can emerge when society's material culture, like technology, advances faster than its non-material culture, like values and norms. For example, um, there's this question about a community. Community might rapidly adopt smartphones while still adhering to traditional farming practices. So in short, there's this progress in material culture, but there's this lag in the immaterial or non-material culture. This shows a dissonance. In short, there's no parallel progress between the two types of culture. This dissonance between old ways of life and new technologies. That's culture lag, as you can recall. This phenomenon reflects the relationship between technology and culture when one does not always progress at the same pace as the other. But in culture, lag. Take note as well that we explored how indigenous cultures are often subject to idealized or oversimplified perceptions, as reflected in the quote, noble savage mentality. This view romanticizes indigenous peoples as pure and untainted by modern civilization, often overlooking the complexities and challenges they face. This view, this noble savage mentality, can be problematic. Why? Because it fails to recognize the agency, right, and the adaptability of indigenous cultures in the face of modernity and globalization. In short, this global savage mentality alienates these indigenous cultures as simplistic, right, and passive. They're not capable of a unique inner logic that they can use or they can create to blend nature and nurture. Okay, before we close this part, we also tackled the web influences that shape popular culture, whether through historical legacies, commercial interests, technological advancements, and different frameworks. But more on that in the next part. Okay. There. Okay. So we also talked about the timeline of Philippine pop culture, but we cannot tackle all of that now. Just the just the highlights that will emerge or that will come out in the exam. In examining the development of Filipino cinema, which is part of our culture, during the early 20th century, we cannot overlook the profound influence of American colonization. Okay. So, anito sa American colonization. Rather than discouraging local film production, the entry of American techniques but actually provided a framework for Filipino filmmakers to explore their national identity in novel ways. By adopting elements of American filmmaking while interweaving uniquely Filipino narratives, the industry began to craft a cinematic voice that spoke to the struggles and aspirations of its people. This period marked a crucial point where Filipino directors began using the medium not only for entertainment, but as a tool for social commentary and cultural expression. That's in the early 20th century, right? During the American period and afterwards. But moving forward to the 1970s, a new sound began to dominate the airwaves called the Manila Sound. Unlike the folk music movements that promoted indigenous sounds or earlier influences of American jazz and blues, Manila Sound emerged as a genre that blended Western pop music with Filipino narratives. This hybrid music style in Manila Sound resonated deeply with audiences, presenting a fusion of global and local elements. It became a representation of Filipino urban life, encapsulating the complexities of identity during a time of political and unrest and cultural shifts. That's the 1970s. Now, the wave of globalization in the 1990s and 2000s further expanded the contours of Filipino pop culture. Rather than erasing local cultural narratives, globalization in that period opened doors for Filipino artists, particularly in music, to blend global sounds with traditional elements. This is a trend in the early 20th century, right? Alternative rock, a genre that rose to prominence during this period, saw Filipino musicians incorporate both foreign influences and distinctly local sensibilities. This blending, this local blending, allowed Filipino music to remain rooted in its cultural context while also appealing to an increasingly interconnected world. But we can go back to the 16th century. From the 16th century through the early 20th century, external forces such as Spanish Catholicism and later American pop culture played important roles in shaping Filipino pop culture, right? For example, Spanish colonization introduced new religious and cultural dimensions that reshaped local traditions, while American occupation brought with it an influx of new media forms, particularly cinema and music. There's no um, sophisticated cinema and music that is local in its style before the American occupation. These influences did not completely erase indigenous practices, but rather merged with them, creating a hybridized form of cultural expression that continues to evolve. In the 1970s and 1980s, we have Filipino filmmakers like for example, Lino Broca and Ismael Bernal, who wielded their craft as a means of political and social critique, particularly under the oppressive Marcos regime. Right, this is the period of the martial law and the slow resistance that eventually led to EDSA. Their films, the films of Broca and Bernal, reflected the growing discontent with the political situation, using cinema as a platform to address issues of poverty, corruption, and human rights abuses. Their works remain significant today, not only for their artistry, but for their bold engagement with the realities of the time. The 2010s and the 2020s marked a new era in Filipino pop culture, one dominated by digital platforms. These platforms democratized cultural production, allowing Filipino artists to reach both national and global audiences with unprecedented ease. For the first time, artists could bypass traditional gatekeepers and connect directly with their fans. This shift not only elevated the visibility of Filipino artists, but also allowed for the creation of content that could remain authentically Filipino while resonating with global audiences. The rise of streaming platforms like Netflix in the 2010s further revolutionized the global visibility of Filipino narratives. Contrary to fears that such platforms would dilute local content to fit global tastes, Netflix enabled Filipino films to reach international audiences while preserving their local essence. This newfound visibility has allowed for a more diverse and accurate representation of Filipino culture on the global stage, ensuring that local stories continue to thrive in the age of digital media. Television also played a critical role in shaping Filipino culture, a Filipino cultural identity. When we go back, especially in the post-EDSA revolution era, it became a key platform constructing a collective identity, blending global formats with local concerns. Filipino television shows, Filipino television shows adapted um, adapted global models to fit the country's unique socio-political landscape, contributing to nuance in what it means to be a Filipino. Let's go back again because the items are not in chronological order. So, the late 19th century saw print journalism um, playing a vital role in the anti-colonial movement. Okay? That's the late 19th century, the time of the KKK. Far from prompting colonial policies, print media at that time, go backwards, became a powerful tool for political resistance and debate. Newspapers, pamphlets, these circulated revolutionary ideas, helping to build a national consciousness that would eventually lead to independence. This period demonstrates the importance of media in reshaping public opinion and fostering political change. In the 1950s, the so-called golden age of Philippine cinema emerged as a reflection of Pierre Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital. During this time, the status of filmmakers and actors elevated their social standing, influencing both public 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 taste and social hierarchies. Cinema became more than just entertainment. It shaped cultural discourse and contributed to the social stratification of Philippine society. Language. Language also evolved during this period in the 1950s, as is seen in the rise of quote Taglish, which is a combination of Tagalog and English used in everyday conversations. This code switching This code switching phenomenon highlights the fluidity of Filipino linguistic and in general cultural practices, adapting to the influences of colonization while maintaining the country's indigenous linguistic roots. A key example of this linguistic borrowing is the loanword code, atik, which reflects how foreign terms are indigenized into everyday Filipino speech. Musically, the pre-Hispanic period saw the use of indigenous instruments like the kulintang and the bamboo flute. Though instruments like the piano, which came much later, are not part of this traditional indigenous landscape. Um, this rich musical heritage demonstrates the adaptability and resilience of Filipino culture, which has absorbed various influences over centuries while still maintaining its core identity. The process of indigenization of Philippine cuisine mirrors the broader historical context of cultural exchange through trade and colonization. Rather than resisting foreign influences outright, Filipinos adapted these elements into local tastes, creating a unique culinary tradition that reflects the country's complex history. For example, there are ways of cooking that came from the Chinese, the Spanish, but we created a Filipino version of it. This culinary fusion illustrates how Filipinos have always negotiated their identity in the face of external pressures creating something distinctively their own. We're down to the very last part of the exam. In reflecting on the integration of indigenous and foreign musical forms in the Philippines, we see um, a manifestation of the country's broader cultural evolution. This synthesis of local and external influences exemplifies how Filipino identity has been shaped through adaptation on the one hand and innovation on the other over time. Rather than experiencing a simple loss of native traditions, Filipinos have creatively woven foreign elements into their own musical and cultural expressions, a pattern mirrored in various aspects of their identity formation. Similarly, the evolution of Filipino values over time illustrates the interplay between indigenous and colonial forces. Filipino values are not static relics of the pre-colonial era, but rather an amalgamation. What mean by amalgamation? A mix of influences from Chinese trade interactions and Western colonization. These diverse influences have led to a set of values um, that continue to, that continue to adapt to external pressures while maintaining a unique Filipino essence. This fusion speaks to the resilience and flexibility of Filipino culture in the face of historical challenges. Now, let's go to the specifics. Those are broad generalizations. In the global diaspora, Filipino values like, for example, bayanihan and kapwa or shared identity manifest in the creation of supportive communities abroad. Filipinos, known for their sense of community, often recreate this tight-knit networks wherever they go, allowing them to maintain a collective identity even in foreign lands. This tendency to form strong communities speaks to the enduring relevance of Filipino cultural values in a globalized world. After all, going back in history, the Austronesians, which are seafaring people who have settled in the Philippines, played a foundational role in the shaping of the early cultural landscape of our archipelago. Their movement across vast oceans laid the groundwork for the eventual development of Filipino society, contributing to the linguistic, cultural, and technological exchanges that defined early Philippine history. So this Austronesian past of the Philippines is crucial to understand contemporary Philippine pop culture, right? Because this shows that we were already cosmopolitan even at the Austronesian phase. Filipino religiosity experienced significant shifts between 1991 and 1998, with an increase in the belief in a personal God and a more literal interpretation of the Bible. Now we're talking about culture, which is a lens by which we can understand Philippine pop culture in general. This suggests a move toward fundamentalism. What's fundamentalism? In fundamentalism, Christian doctrines are increasingly seen as absolute truths. This shift in the period reflects broader social changes and highlights how religious beliefs can adapt to the socio-political context, providing a sense of certainty during times of change. Bonifacio's notion, Andres Bonifacio's notion of blood compact offers an interesting parallel to the Enlightenment concept of the social contract. In short, in the exam, one item will talk about the relationship between Enlightenment ideals, okay, and Philippine um, Philippine philosophy, Filipino philosophy during the revolution. For example, for Bonifacio, the breaking down the colonial social contract, wherein the rulers were expected to protect the well-being of the governed, justified the revolution against the Spanish rule. This interpretation aligns with Enlightenment ideas of governance, wherein a breach in the social contract, as you can read about um, in Thomas Hobbes, in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, this breach validates the right to resist oppressive authorities. In contrast, Renato Constantine and his critique of neo-colonialism shows a tension between economic dependence and political independence, while Manuel Quezon leaned towards a more pragmatic political negotiation with the United States. Renato Constantino advocated for a more genuine economic and political independence from foreign influences. This tension reflects the broader debate in Philippine history about the true path to sovereignty in a post-colonial world. Now, let's now go back to pop culture once again in the contemporary, very, very contemporary scene. We have this song from the Unela with the line, like my first time living life the day I met you. This evokes what? This evokes Hegel's concept of self-consciousness, right? In Hegel's philosophy, the recognition of the beloved brings about a new self-awareness, which is a transformative experience that allows for the growth of the self. This idea is reflected in the lyrics, where love catalyzes a deeper understanding of life, suggesting that personal relationships can lead to profound self-realization. You have already answered an activity about this, so can you elaborate about that anymore? Similarly, the commodification of beauty is abundantly captured in different lines in the song, drawing from, for example, we can interpret it using postmodernism. We can interpret it using different theoretical lenses. One of them, for example, is through Marx and Adorno. Marx and Adorno had this concept of fetishism, right? Here, beauty is reduced to an object to be possessed, mirroring the capitalist tendency to commodify even the most personal and intimate aspects of life. This idea critiques how consumer culture transforms the relationships um, and the art that we engage with in the real world into mere objects of consumption. Um, BL series like Together and Hello Stranger. These series have been shaped by a combination of factors, including the appeal of attractive male leads, LGBT representation, and the accessibility of global platforms. However, there's this paper by Reyes 2020, which notes that the series did not proliferate gender stereotypes, uh, positioning these shows as vehicles for alternative storytelling and broader cultural conversations. This also manifests the view of popular culture as a battlefield for hegemony, right? Or this battle for how the public will see the LGBTQ community. In the very last part of our discussion, we talked about um, one root of Filipino pop culture, which is the indigenous peoples, the IPs. Murag layo na siya, but still, this is still part of uh, the syllabus because according to the source, we still need to understand Filipino culture as such to understand Filipino pop culture. So we have RA 8371, which outlines the criteria for indigenous peoples in the Philippines, with an emphasis on self-assertion, ancestral domain claims, and historical resistance to colonization. Notably, openness to assimilation into contemporary society does not qualify a group as an IP, emphasizing that um, it is important to maintain distinct cultural identities. In short, they have to be pure. A community, a society has to be pure from corruption, from contemporary modern society to become to qualify in the criteria for indigenous peoples. This legislation, this RA 8371, serves as a crucial step in the preservation of indigenous rights and cultures in the modern Philippines. The Lumad of Mindanao exemplify the diversity within the IT communities, particularly as non-Islamized ethnic groups distinct from the Muslim communities that inhabit the region. Again, what do you mean by Lumad? Kinsa man ang mga Lumad sa Mindanao? These are the non-Islamized ethnic groups. In short, they're not Muslims. They are just uh, they maintain their traditional religious culture. Okay? They're ethnic groups in Mindanao that inhabit the region. This distinction underscores the cultural and religious pluralism in the Philippines, further highlighting the unique experiences of indigenous peoples compared to other ethnic groups. In short, not all parts of Mindanao have been Islamized, right? Finally, agriculture remains the primary source of livelihood for many indigenous peoples in the Philippines. This reliance on agriculture ties the livelihoods of these communities to their ancestral lands, making the legal recognition of these lands even more critical for their economic survival and cultural preservation. All right, that's it. Good luck in the exams and see you tomorrow. Bye.